George Rawlins by St. George's Hill. Having lost the belief of youth that death will let me pass, I sought secrets inside a senseless birth, a savory stuffed with beef and scripture. In mother's kitchen, knives like a feathered brigade lined the wall. A silent cord laid darkly across the planks, with the shadow of St. George's Hill to make black pudding thickened with the blood of thanks. My morning, hungry for tomorrow, I think what havoc I might spin for a moldering wheel of cheddar. How to imagine a better day over a cockcrow bowl of paste, and carry on toasting to our youth. You have nothing but the finest tongue. Just yesterday I visited a friend's farm. The choir of milking machines calmed the heifers. Those aluminum angels labor for nothing but our succor. Our cream white clothes poured from a vat of chemicals. No sheep need shearing. And please, Tom, take care to shoo them from the feed bins, else they chew until their stomachs burst. Whether your world or this, our days are a simple succotash. We'll be remembered for how we succumbed to what we didn't say. For me, poetry is a way to create meaning, explore the world in a way that can be rational, but isn't limited to that, which I think is somewhat unique to poetry, and maybe some poetic styles of fiction. And you can do it all with nothing but a piece of paper and a 5-cent pencil. Because thought is really language, poetry can lead to perceptions that are otherwise impossible. You can create rational poetry, emotional, spiritual, surreal. The only limits to poetry are the language itself and our imaginations. So poetry allows me to understand life and what it means to be human. This is a poem from my manuscript that's going to be published pretty soon, Sheepside Afterlife, which is a series of 57 sonnets that, in conversation with the British poet Thomas Chatterton, who lived in the 18th century. Chatterton began writing poetry at age 11, and by 16 he invented an imaginary poet from the 15th century, writing hundreds of lines of poetry on old manuscript paper he found in a basement of a church, and tried to sell these as authentic artifacts to the literati of London, mainly Horace Walpole, to try to support his mother and sister, who were poverty-stricken. When that failed, he went to London to write political pamphlets, and a few months after that, at 17, he committed suicide. He left behind 500 pages of poetry. Pretty much astonishing number for a 17-year-old child, basically. In this poem, I try to imagine how he may have felt at a certain point of his life after his rejection by Walpole and before leaving Bristol for London. And I try to imagine how his life might have been, how difficult it must have been, and contrast that poverty in the 18th century of his life to my own modern, relatively affluent life. So I don't remember exactly this poem. There's 56 other sonnets in the book, but typically I follow a process where I have to start a poem, and trying to get started is the biggest problem. So I have certain processes to start. One is I might read a poem by somebody who I want to be influenced by, and that could be any kind of poet. Even a poet who has really nothing stylistically to do with what I'm trying to write, but that allows me to kind of maybe bring something new into to the poem. In this case, a sonnet. So that might just be a line or a phrase from that poet. and then that allows me to kind of start with some sort of structure. At that point, I might put on headphones and listen to music, and kind of use maybe an automatic writing technique to try to move the lines down the page and try to get more and more material to work with that I can then start revising at some point. So once I get a certain amount of lines and I feel like I've got a thought or something to work with, I start applying my rational mind to the poem and start looking for word choices that might be too obvious, trying to make it more surprising, trying to make it consistent, basically trying to just improve the basic impulse that I started with. Well, a sonnet is a 14-line poem. Typically, there would be iambic pentameter. There would be 5 stresses for each line. That's basically what a sonnet is. It's basically a 14-line poem. I pretty much stretch the definition of a sonnet, basically just keeping it at 14 lines. So I call those sonnets because they're 14 lines. I think it's helpful to think of poetry as being letting language lead the mind and the emotions, and not trying to necessarily have an idea for a poem, and to let the form of poetic form and meter, and the language itself to kind of move you to some discoveries you might not have come to otherwise. I believe language is not just a tool, it's the vehicle of thought itself. So if you recognize that and let language determine thought and follow that, you may come to surprising places that you might not have been able to get to otherwise. I think you have to approach every poem maybe differently depending on the poem. Usually when I read a poem several times, I don't analyze poems too much, but the more I read a poem, the more I understand it. And you start to notice things that you didn't read just reading it one time. Some poems might yield that very quickly, like I'm thinking of Mark Strand's poem, Keeping Things Whole. You can read that poem and you pretty much see the brilliance right away, and you don't have to reread it too many times. A poet, I think, is very extraordinary. An older poet named Russell Edson, who died maybe 5 years ago. He had an ability to kind of create a world with its own logic, and an alternate world that with its own laws of physics, it seemed to me. And I think his poem Angels might exemplify that as much as any. Angels, they have little use. They are best as objects of torment. No government cares what you do to them. Like birds, and yet so human. They mate briefly, looking at each other. Their eggs are like white jelly beans. Sometimes they have been said to inspire a man to do more with his life than he might have. But what is there for a man to do with his life? They burn beautifully with a blue flame. When they cry out, it is like a screech of a tiny hinge, the cry of a bat. No one hears it. Well, I give a shout out to you, Todd, for doing this project you've got going here. You've got a lot of great material there on your website, and I think you're doing a great thing.